The hand landed on his shoulder at precisely the moment Joe Rivera's left boot was leaving the mat. Not a grab, not a shove. An old man's open palm laid with deliberate gentleness across the dark wool of Joe's uniform jacket, at the point where the shoulder seam met the collar. The weight of it was no more than a folded newspaper. The crowd around the plaza went silent so fast it was as if someone had cut a cord. Joe did not flinch. He did not stop the count in his head. His left boot descended, and then he was standing still on the white marble mat with both feet planted, his M14 at shoulder arms, the chrome of the barrel catching the gray November morning, and a 96-year-old man's hand resting on his shoulder, like something placed there by a much longer history than this single day. What no one standing behind the rope line that morning knew yet was the reason Joe Rivera could bear that weight without moving. They would learn it. The morning would teach them. The day had begun the way every day began at the tomb of the unknown soldier, which is to say it began before most people in the Washington area had opened their eyes. Joe had drawn the 0600 relief on the 10th of November, the morning before Veterans Day, which meant he had been at his locker in the guard quarters well before 5, under the fluorescent light, attending to his uniform, with a specific deliberateness the old guard required and that Joe himself had long since made personal. The low-quarter shoes came first. He had polished them the night before, and he polished them again that morning, working a small amount of wax into the toe with a cloth wrapped around 2 fingers, buffing in tight circles until the leather held his reflection. Not because the night's polish had degraded, because the act of doing it reminded him why he was doing it. The trousers were pressed with a crease, sharp enough to draw blood, as the saying went in the regiment. The coat was brushed. The white ascot was folded and secured precisely. The white gloves went on last, and he flexed his fingers once inside them, feeling the familiar slight constriction, the way the cotton made every motion deliberate. Corporal Dennis Falk was at the next locker, working his own shoes, and neither of them spoke for the first 10 minutes of that preparation. Falk had been Joe's relief partner for 7 months. He was a compact man from western Ohio, 24 years old, and he had learned early that Joe Rivera brought a quality of focus to preparation that was not unfriendly, but was not open to small talk. Falk respected that. He applied the same silence to his own kit, and when they finished and checked each other in the corridor, it was Falk who said only, "Good," and Joe who nodded once, and they walked together toward the plaza. The approach to the tomb itself is a short walk from the guard quarters, and Joe had made it enough times that his body knew the distance and the slight elevation change without consulting his eyes. He came around the corner of the memorial amphitheater, and the tomb appeared as it always appeared, white and absolute, set against the long roll of Arlington's hillside and the bare November trees. The inscription on the sarcophagus faced him as he walked toward the mat. "Here rests in honored glory an American soldier known but to God." He read it every time. He made a point of that. He had read it on his first day in the regiment, and he had read it every day since because a thing seen too many times, without attention, becomes invisible. And he would not let that happen to these words. The 0600 relief proceeded with the formal precision it always did. The outgoing sentinel was relieved by the sergeant of the guard's command, and Joe stepped onto the mat, and then he was alone with the walk. 21 steps to the south end of the mat. That number is not arbitrary. It matches the highest honor a military ceremony can render, and the men and women of the old guard carry the count in their bodies the way other people carry a heartbeat. Joe took those steps heel to toe, in a pace that was neither fast nor slow, measured by a standard that had been maintained at this post through every decade since 1937. He reached the south end, stopped, and executed the facing movement, turning on his heel to face the tomb for 21 seconds. He counted. He always counted. The count was a vow renewed in silence. He turned again, executed the rifle shoulder transfer, with the precise hand-over-hand movement the regiment specified, brought the M14 up on the opposite shoulder, and walked the 21 steps back. North end, turn, 21 seconds. The crowd that had gathered was perhaps 40 people at that early hour, larger than a weekday average and growing, because the morning before Veterans Day drew the ones who came on purpose rather than the ones who wandered in from a general tour of the grounds. There was a row of men in baseball caps along the rope line, older men with the deliberate posture of people who had once worn a uniform and whose bodies had not entirely forgotten it. A school group in matching jackets stood slightly to their left. A teacher at each end, the children quieter than school groups usually manage to be because the tomb has that effect. A woman in a dark coat stood near the center of the rope line, alone, her hands folded at her waist. She was perhaps in her mid-70s, with gray hair pinned under a small hat. She was watching Joe with an attention that was different from the tourist's attention. It was the attention of someone who had earned the right to watch. Her name was Margaret Pruitt, and Joe did not know it yet. He would learn it before the morning was over. At approximately 07:20, a small group entered the plaza from the east walkway, moving slowly. There were 4 of them. 2 were in the khaki uniform of the Department of Veterans Affairs Escort Service. 1 was a woman in her 40s, carrying a clipboard and wearing a lanyard that identified her as hospital staff. And the 4th was a man who moved on a 4-pronged aluminum cane, placing it with care before each step, wearing a uniform that was not a costume. The uniform was Army khaki, the summer service dress of the Second World War Pacific Theater, with ribbons Joe's eye cataloged in the first pass. The Asiatic Pacific Campaign Medal, with 4 bronze service stars, the Philippine Liberation Ribbon, the Combat Infantryman Badge, the Good Conduct Medal, and above them all, the Combat Infantryman Badge, a second time because the Army had awarded it retroactively to the Pacific veterans who had earned it and waited 30 years for the paperwork to catch up. The uniform fit him the way old uniforms fit men, who have shrunk over the decades but have refused to alter the cloth, hanging slightly loose at the shoulders, the collar with a centimeter of space at the throat. He was 96 years old, and he walked like a man who was going to walk to the tomb even if it took him an hour. His name was Walter Marsh, and he had not been to Arlington in 40 years. The crowd noticed him the moment he entered the plaza. The school group noticed because they could see his uniform. The men in baseball caps noticed because several of them straightened without thinking about it. Margaret Pruitt noticed, and her folded hands separated briefly, as if she had considered reaching out, then closed again at her waist. Behind Joe on the mat, the 21 steps continued. He had not yet seen Walter. His back was to the east walkway at the moment of the group's arrival, and he was in the return walk, south to north, counting the internal cadence that was not mechanical, but absolute. A man near the middle of the rope line leaned toward the woman next to him and said, in a voice low enough to be private but carrying in the quiet morning air, "The old fellow's going to walk right past the rope." He said it without malice, the way a person says something they believe is obvious. "Look at him. He's just going to walk right up." The woman beside him pressed her lips together and said nothing. Joe reached the north end of the mat, stopped, turned and stood in his 21-second count, and now for the first time he could see the east walkway. He saw the group. He processed the uniform in the same single pass any old guard sentinel would make, and he saw the man's direction of travel, which was not toward the viewing area, but toward the mat itself. And he saw that the two VA escorts had paused to speak with a park ranger near the amphitheater door, their attention briefly divided. Joe completed his 21 seconds. He began his south walk. Walter Marsh continued toward the mat. The rope line on the east side of the plaza ran on a low iron post and chain configuration, the chain at knee height. For most visitors, it was a clear demarcation. For a man moving on a four-pronged cane with his attention fixed on the white sarcophagus ahead of him, it was an obstacle he stepped around without seeming to register it as a boundary at all. He moved the cane to his right hand, lifted his left foot over the chain with the slow deliberateness of a man who had climbed over worse things in his life, and then he was on the plaza floor, proper, outside the rope. A sound ran through the crowd, not a word, a held breath collectively. The man who had murmured earlier said quietly, "I told you." Joe was at the midpoint of the South Walk. He heard the shift in the crowd's quality. His peripheral vision registered the figure approaching from his right side. He held his cadence and continued walking. Because the walk does not stop for crowd noise, and it does not stop for a figure at the edge of vision, and it does not stop until the sentinel decides it must. Walter reached the edge of the mat. He stopped. He looked at the sarcophagus. He looked at the inscription. His lips moved briefly without sound. And then he turned and looked at Joe Rivera walking toward him. And something in his face did not change but deepened, the way a long-held expression deepens when the thing it has been waiting for finally arrives. Joe took the final steps of his south walk and reached the south end. He executed the facing movement. He stood in his count. Walter stepped onto the mat. The two VA escorts were already moving from the amphitheater door, but they were 30 feet away and Walter was already walking, and the distance between an old man in motion and two people who did not want to cause a scene by running was enough to let the next moment happen. Walter placed his hand on Joe Rivera's shoulder. Joe felt it. The weight of it was small. The intention behind it was enormous. He held his count, 5 seconds remaining, and he stood with his rifle at shoulder arms and an old man's hand on his shoulder, and the crowd so quiet behind him that he could hear the wind moving through the bare trees on the hillside. He had stood at this post for 2 years and 4 months. He had stood here in July heat that made the marble shimmer, and in January cold that made his breath visible on each turn. He had stood here in rain, in ceremony, in the long gray ordinary days that formed the majority of any post-rotation and that received no photographs and produced no witnesses. He had stood here because Marco had not come home, and because someone had to, and because of the two brothers Rivera. The one who remained was the one who would do this. Marco Rivera had been 23 when he was killed in Kunar Province in the spring of 2011. Joe had been 16. He had learned about his brother's death on a Thursday afternoon in a living room in San Antonio, delivered by 2 men in dress greens at the front door, and the fact of it had taken the next 11 years of his life to fully understand. Not accept. Understand. There was a photograph of Marco in the breast pocket of Joe's uniform coat, a 3x2-inch print of his brother in his patrol gear, laughing at something off-camera taken 3 weeks before the patrol that ended his life. Joe had carried the photograph at every post since his first rotation, and he had never shown it to anyone, and he had never needed to. It was not something that required display. It was something that required presence. Private First Class Marco Rivera, 3rd Battalion, 12th Infantry, the only Rivera of his generation to wear the uniform before Joe. The reason Joe wore it now. The 21 seconds completed. Joe Rivera turned. He turned on his heel with the full precision of 2 years and 4 months of this specific movement, at this specific post. And for the first time on that morning, he was face to face with Walter Marsh. And what Joe saw was a man of 96 years standing upright on a cane, with his chin level and his eyes very clear, and his hand still resting, with its full, quiet deliberateness on Joe's shoulder. The crowd did not breathe. The tourist who had murmured twice earlier opened his mouth and said nothing. Behind the rope line, the woman in the dark coat, Margaret Pruitt, pressed her right hand flat against the front of her coat, over her chest, and held it there. Corporal Falk had come up from the relief point at the south end, where he had been standing ready, and he stopped at the base of the mat steps when he saw what was unfolding. He did not intervene. His job in that moment, by his own judgment, was to witness. The 2 VA escorts reached the edge of the mat and stopped there, because something in the quality of the silence told them that moving further would be wrong. Walter's hand remained on Joe's shoulder. His eyes were on Joe's face, and what they held was not apology and not confusion. It was recognition. It was the look of a man who understood with complete clarity that the person standing in front of him was bearing something the same weight and shape as what he had been bearing for the better part of 7 decades, and that the bearing of it was the whole of the point. Walter said quietly enough that only Joe and perhaps the nearest person behind the rope could hear it clearly. "I know what this cost you, son." Joe Rivera stood at the position of modified attention, his rifle at shoulder arms, and he looked at the old man in front of him. And the count of 21 seconds was already past, and the next walk was pending, and the post did not stop. He did what the post required. He did what the moment required. He did them both in a single action, which was the action the old guard permitted him and no other. Joe said, "Sir, this post is held." 8 words. Level. Without volume and without warmth and without coldness, in the specific declarative register that cited the duty rather than the man. The breaking point line in every tomb guard story is the one the sentinel does not improvise. It arrives from the same place the 21 steps arrive from. The accumulated weight of everyone who has walked this mat before him. Walter Marsh heard it. His hand did not move from Joe's shoulder immediately. He held it there for 1 more second, and then he removed it with the same deliberate gentleness with which he had placed it. And he straightened, or tried to straighten, his 96-year-old spine, and the slight tremble that ran through his frame was not weakness. It was the involuntary movement of a man who has been holding something in for a very long time. He said, "Carry on, soldier." 2 words, spoken in a register that matched Joe's own. Then one of the VA escorts was gently at Walter's elbow, and the school group behind the rope was as still as the school group had ever been in its collective experience of field trips. And the man who had murmured twice about the old fellow walking right past the rope had not said anything for the last 4 minutes, and did not say anything now. Joe turned back to the north end of the mat, completed his facing movement, and began the next 21 steps. The crowd exhaled. It was not a dramatic sound. It was a room's worth of people releasing air they had been holding without realizing it. A collective unburdening that was quieter than applause and heavier than silence. A man in one of the baseball caps at the rope line removed it from his head without being asked and held it against his chest. 2 more men did the same, following the first the way people follow a correct instinct when they see it performed. The teacher at the left end of the school group said something to her nearest student, in a voice too low to carry, and the student nodded and did not look away from Joe's retreating figure on the mat. Margaret Pruitt stood where she had stood all morning, her hand still pressed flat against the front of her coat. Her husband's name was on a panel in Panel 38 west of the Vietnam Veterans Memorial across the river, and she had stood at this rope line on the 10th of November for the past 11 years, because it was one day before Veterans Day, and Arlington was quiet at 700, and she preferred the tomb in the quiet. She had never seen anything like what she had just seen, and she did not move from her place, and her hand did not leave her chest. The VA escorts guided Walter back toward the rope line, moving slowly to match his pace. He went with them without resistance, his cane working on the stone, his eyes still turned toward the mat and the figure of Joe Rivera walking north. At the rope, Walter stopped. He squared his shoulders, or performed the nearest thing to squaring his shoulders that his frame allowed. He transferred the cane to his left hand. He brought his right hand up in a salute. It was not the casual, two-fingered salute of a man going through a motion. It was the flat-handed, elbow-level, held salute of a man who had been taught the correct form 75 years ago and had not forgotten it. He held it for several seconds, facing the mat, facing Joe Rivera's back on the 21 steps, held it until his arm gave the slight tremor that 96 years of life had made inevitable, and then he lowered it. Corporal Falk, at the base of the mat steps, had seen all of it. He was 24 years old, and he had been at the tomb for 6 months, and in those 6 months he had seen tourists cross the rope by accident and by stubbornness, and once by something that might have been a dare, and he had seen the sergeant of the guard issue warnings, and he had seen his partner, Joe Rivera, walk his post through rain and ceremony and ordinary gray mornings. He had never seen a morning like this one. He said, not loudly, but in the carrying voice of a person who is not trying to hide what they mean, Joe held his post. That was all he said. It was enough. The man with the baseball cap still in his hands at his chest looked at Falk and then back at the mat, and he nodded once. The teacher at the left end of the school group wrote something in the small notebook she carried, quickly, before she could forget the exact words. Sergeant First Class Owens arrived from the amphitheater entrance at 0743. He was the sergeant of the guard for the morning rotation, a 12-year veteran of the regiment, with the bearing of a man who had seen the full range of what a public, sacred post attracts, from the deeply reverent to the deeply careless, and he had developed over those 12 years a specific economy of response that matched the situation to the minimum required action and no more. He walked to the south end of the mat, stood alongside Falk, and watched Joe Rivera complete a full pass, north to south. South end turn, 21 seconds, south to north. He asked Falk in a low voice what had occurred. Falk told him. Quietly and precisely, in the sequence it had happened, without editorializing. Owens listened. He watched Joe on the mat. He looked toward the rope line where Walter Marsh was now seated in a folding chair one of the VA escorts had produced from a bag, the old man watching the mat with the focused attention of someone who intended to watch for as long as he was able. Owens said, Sentinel used authorized discretion, contact received, post maintained, no violation. He said it the way a sergeant confirms a fact that is already established and simply needs to be named aloud to close the procedural loop. He said it to Falk, and Falk nodded, and that was the institutional confirmation. He stayed until Joe completed another full pass. Then he walked back toward the amphitheater entrance, unhurried, because there was nothing further here that required his presence. If the crowd had expected something more dramatic from the uniformed senior figure, they did not show it. The crowd had already witnessed the only moment that mattered to them, and they were still in the field of it. The morning continued. Walter watched the mat for 37 minutes. The VA escort team did not rush him. The clipboard woman checked her watch twice but did not speak. The folding chair was at the edge of the rope, positioned so Walter could face the tomb directly, and for those 37 minutes he sat without taking his eyes from the mat and from the figure of Joe Rivera, walking his 21 steps in both directions, turning and counting and transferring the rifle with the white-gloved precision that had not varied by a single degree since 0600. At some point in those 37 minutes, the tourist, who had murmured twice in the morning's early stretch, turned to his companion and said, in a voice pitched low enough that it was not meant to be general, "I didn't understand what I was looking at." His companion said nothing. She put her hand in his, and they both faced the mat. The school group, against every probability of a school group held in one place for more than 20 minutes, had not migrated or lost its shape. The children watched. Their teacher had stopped writing in the small notebook. Some things are not well served by note-taking. At 0820, the VA escorts indicated to Walter that the transport was waiting. Walter acknowledged them with a slight nod. He placed the cane on the stone in front of the chair and used it to stand, a process that took the better part of a minute, and during which no one in the crowd moved or made any sound that might distract his concentration from the work of standing. He stood. He turned toward the mat one final time, toward Joe Rivera on the North Pass, 21 steps returning toward the south end. He said something. It was not audible from most of the crowd's position. The woman in the dark coat, Margaret Pruitt, was close enough that she might have caught it, and later she would be unable to say exactly what the words were, only that the sound of them was the same sound as a conclusion. Not an ending. A conclusion. The kind of sound a man makes when he has done the thing he came to do. Then the escorts were guiding Walter back along the east walkway, his cane on the stone, his khaki uniform moving through the gray November morning, the 4 bronze service stars on his chest catching the flat light as he went. He did not look back. A man who has done the thing he came to do does not look back. The crowd watched him until he was gone from the plaza. Margaret Pruitt waited until the party had disappeared around the corner of the amphitheater. Then she pressed both hands against the front of her coat for a moment, as if confirming something she had been holding, and she released them to her sides. She did not leave immediately. She stayed until Joe's next full pass was complete, north to south and south to north, and then she turned and walked toward the Memorial Drive exit with the particular deliberateness of a person who has received something they will spend time with. A woman at the edge of the school group, one of the parent chaperones who had stood quietly at the back all morning, asked the teacher in a carrying whisper, "Who was the old man?" The teacher said, "A Pacific veteran, 96 years old." The chaperone took a breath. She looked at the mat, at Joe's figure on the return walk, and she said, "He knew." She did not specify what the old man had known. She did not need to. Several people in the cluster nodded. Falk remained at the south end of the mat until the relief rotation. He watched his partner on the 21 steps, with the quiet focus of a person who is witness to something that happened and is also confirming for himself what it means. Joe Rivera walked the mat with the same bearing he had carried at 0600, when the morning was empty and the crowd was small and the man in the Pacific uniform had not yet come through the east walkway. The walk was the same. It was always the same. That was the point of it. At 0900, the sergeant of the guard called the relief. The ceremony was precise and formal, the new sentinel moving into position with the measured movements the post required, and Joe executed the handoff and came off the mat and stood at the south end beside Falk at parade rest for the completion of the ceremony. Falk said nothing for a moment. Then he said, "You all right?" Joe said, "Yes." It was not a short answer. It was a complete answer. They walked back toward the guard quarters together, through the memorial amphitheater and down the corridor that smelled of floor wax and wool, and Joe removed his white gloves at the locker room entrance and set them on the shelf above his locker, and for a moment he stood with his hand on the door of the locker without opening it. He put his right hand to the breast pocket of his coat, not reaching inside, just pressing his palm flat against the wool over the slight rectangular outline of the photograph, the way a person checks that something important is still there, not because they doubt it, but because the act of confirming it is its own form of carrying it. Marco had been 23. Joe was 27 now. He had been, for just over 2 years, the older brother. He was not sure what to do with that except to keep walking. He opened the locker. He hung his coat with care, smoothing the shoulder seam. He set the shoes on the lower shelf. He placed the white gloves in the flat box where they were stored between rotations, and he folded the box shut with the same small precision with which he had done everything that morning. After a few minutes, Falk came back to the door of the locker room and said, "There's a thing I've been trying to figure out how to say." Joe waited. Falk said, "When he put his hand on your shoulder, I could see your face from where I was standing. You didn't look like a man being interrupted." He paused. "You looked like a man being understood." Joe considered that. He nodded once slowly. He did not add anything to it, and Falk did not need him to. At 1400 that afternoon, Joe drew a second rotation, the Veterans Day Eve afternoon post, which ran until 1700. It was not unusual to draw 2 rotations in a single day when the regiment's schedule required it, and on the morning before Veterans Day, the schedule often required it. He dressed again in the same deliberateness, checked the shoes again, checked the coat, retrieved the white gloves from the flat box and put them on, and flexed his fingers once inside them. He walked back to the tomb through the late afternoon light, which was still gray but carried a slight amber in it from the low November sun working through cloud cover to the southwest. The crowd at this hour was different. The morning school group was long gone. There were more adults, more people who had driven to Arlington with specific intention. A number of them held small American flags that the cemetery provided at the entrance, and several of them were holding the flags in the still November air in the way people hold things that mean more than the thing itself. Joe stepped onto the mat at the relief, and the 21 steps resumed, and the afternoon crowd watched the way afternoon crowds watched, which was attentively and quietly, because the Veterans Day Eve crowd at the tomb tended toward people who already knew what they were looking at. He walked the mat. He counted. He turned. He stood his 21 seconds, rifle at shoulder arms, the chrome barrel against the pale sky, the white gloves moving through the transfer, with the same exactness that they had moved through it at 0600 and at every post-rotation in between. On his third pass, north to south, he was aware without looking directly that a figure had taken a position near the center of the rope line. He processed the position in his peripheral range the way he processed all of it, continuously and without urgency. Margaret Pruitt had come back. She was in the same dark coat, the same small hat, and she stood in the same position she had occupied since early morning, hands folded at her waist, watching the mat with the same steady attention. She had left after Walter's departure, and she had returned in the afternoon, which is the thing a person does when a morning has given them something they need to stay close to. Joe reached the south end. He turned. He counted his 21 seconds, and in the 10th second of the count, he was facing the crowd, and for one of those seconds, his line of sight passed through the rope line, across the folded hands and the small flags, and the veteran's careful attention, and landed for just a moment on Margaret Pruitt's face. She was not crying. She was not performing grief. She was doing the thing that people who have been through the long work of loss learn to do, which is to hold it steadily without putting it down and without making a scene of it. Her husband's name was on the wall across the river. Her mornings at the tomb were the ritual she had made to go with that fact. What she saw on Joe Rivera's face, in that second of the count, she said later, was the same thing. Joe completed his count and turned back to the north and walked the 21 steps. The late afternoon light had dropped further by 1600. The southwestern amber going the flat gray of full cloud cover, and the flags in the crowd had gone still in the absence of wind. The ceremony at the mat continued with the same complete indifference to weather and light and the passage of afternoon into evening that it had maintained every day since the permanent guard was established. The post does not track the light. The post tracks the count. Discipline is the visible form of grief, not performance, not theater. The actual ongoing act of doing the thing that is owed, at the cost that the doing requires, on the days when it costs, and the days when it costs less, and the days when the cost is so familiar it has been integrated into the body and cannot be separated from it anymore. Marco Rivera had been gone for 13 years, and Joe had been at the tomb for 2 of them, and the walk was the same today as it had been on his first rotation, because it had to be, because anything less was not the point. At 1700, the relief came, and the afternoon rotation ended. Joe came off the mat for the second time that day, and stood at the south end through the ceremony completion, and then he walked back through the amphitheater corridor. And the day was nearly over. In the guard quarters, he went through the end of rotation maintenance with the same attention as always. The shoes went on the shelf. The coat was hung. The gloves were folded into the flat box. He sat on the bench in front of the locker for a moment, in his uniform trousers and his white T-shirt, elbows on his knees. He reached into the coat pocket and took out the photograph. He held it the way he always held it at the end of a day, level in both hands, the image facing up. Marco in his patrol gear, laughing at something off-camera. The patrol base visible in the background. Kunar Province in early spring. Marco had been 23. Joe, at 16, had thought his brother was invincible in the way that 16-year-olds tend to think of their older brothers, which is to say entirely and without examination of the evidence. Walter Marsh had said, "I know what this cost you, son." Joe had not answered that. The post had answered it, held, still, present. 21 steps in each direction, until they said stop, and then 21 steps again. He placed the photograph back in the coat's breast pocket with care, smoothing the pocket flat. Falk appeared in the doorway and said the dinner lineup was in 15 minutes. Joe said he would be there. Falk nodded and went. The hallway beyond the door was quiet except for the sound of the regiment going about its evening, which was orderly and familiar, and, to Joe Rivera, the specific sound of a life in which the people around him could be trusted to do what they said they would do. He was 27 years old. He had been at this post for 2 years and 4 months. Tomorrow was Veterans Day, and the crowd would be larger and the ceremony longer, and he would walk the 21 steps with the same precision in the morning as he had walked them today, and the morning after that, and the morning after that. He closed the locker. He walked to the door and down the corridor toward the mess, And behind him, in the guard quarters, the evening went quiet, and the locker held the coat, and inside the breast pocket of the coat, flat against the wool, was a 3 by 2 inch photograph of a man laughing in the Kunar province spring. And whatever the photograph carried, it would carry it through the night, and Joe would come back in the morning and put the coat on again, and walk out to the mat and begin the count. 21 steps,